In this short video, we're going to cover two topics. One is briefly to look at some exciting anatomical work in brain imaging, and the second concerns the uses and abuses of the prefix neuro when it comes to marketing. So you might think that the anatomy of the brain was a relatively well-known thing. After all, people have been dissecting brains literally for hundreds of years. And yet, new techniques allow us to look at the same tissues in new ways. And two techniques, which we're going to look at now, called diffusion tensor imaging and diffusion spectrum imaging, have in the last 10-15 years opened our eyes to the long-range connectivity between places in the brain. Now, neurons, because they have these long extended axons, necessarily form long-range connections. It's humbling to think that a single cell, one of those pyramidal cells we saw, for example, can have an axon that is literally this long. And that's a cell that's so tiny you wouldn't see it in front of your eyes, and yet it can be this long. But in the brain, those connections are very, very hard to follow. And these new technologies allowed scientists for the first time to trace long-range connections from a single neuron to wherever it led in the brain. And this changed our idea of how the brain is organized. Previous to this, there was a lot of assumption that brains could be described as processors in which there were sequences of stages. And that sort of rules out feedback loops within those connections. But what we've discovered in the last 15 years or so is that the brain is massively recurrently connected, and in general, if one area is connected to another, then there's a connection back. If not direct, then through one or two hops. So we're only just learning the richness of this connectivity, and it's very useful information as we approach the brain and try to figure out how we should understand its mode of operation. The images produced by these techniques are quite startling. They're often sometimes called brain bows because they have this very pleasant graphic look about them. Of course, those colors are all just ink colors. They're not actually in the brain. And the brain you're looking at here is a marmoset brain, but you can see the richness of the connectivity that is revealed here. And that's by the older of these two techniques, by diffusion tensor imaging. Diffusion spectrum imaging is very similar. For our purposes, they might as well be identical. And as recently as 2012, a major anatomical discovery was made in the brain. You wouldn't think there was parts of the brain still to be found, and yet this technique allowed scientists to recognize the existence of a sheet of long-range connections, which you can see in the image there. You can see it extends from the far back of the brain to the far front of the brain, so really of relevance to the entire brain. Its structure is very much like a fabric with a warp and a weft. And it had hitherto gone unnoticed because it's not the kind of thing you bump against with your knife. You don't see this unless you can follow those long-range connections. So there are surprises to be found still in anatomy. The second topic I want to discuss in this video is the use of the term neuro. So we're seeing some brilliant insights from neuroscience, there's no doubt about it. But unfortunately, the work is often misrepresented, and furthermore, neuroscience is basically not understood by journalists, and it is ripe for exploitation by commercial interests. So with the proliferation of imaging technologies, there has been a general sense that our knowledge of the brain is more and more secure. I don't think that's correct. I think we have very many more questions than we used to have. But there has been a regrettable trend of late to develop new pseudo-disciplines by sticking the word neuro on front of something. So we get neuroaesthetics, neuroethics, neuromusicology, neuroart history. In the article that you were asked to read on reasoning, there was an accompanying reading which called itself the neuroscience of screwing up, and there was no neuroscience in that. So the term neuro is being abused When you see neuro in front of one of these things and you go, oh, that's surprising, maybe what we're finding out about the brain is telling us all about art history. Beware, please. One problem we have is that the person is increasingly considered to be captured by the brain. Now, there's a villain in this, and it's a Nobel Prize winner, Francis Crick, one of the guys who uncovered the helical structure of DNA, great scientist in that domain. After he got the Nobel Prize, he moved into cognitive science, and he uttered the following banal falsehood. He said, you are your brain. Your hopes, dreams, ambitions, and so on are nothing more than the brain and synapses. This is not only false, it's pernicious, it's misleading, and it's very frustrating. The person is a rich entity that defies complete characterization. It includes you and everything of value to do with you. Your embedding in your family, in your life, your personal connections, your sense of worth. You are not your brain. But the way we talk about ourselves, increasingly in a neurocentric framework, muddies this water. So keep an eye out for that, and keep an eye out in particular then for people who are willing to try to make money off this. One example of this is the rubbish discipline of neuromarketing. Now, there is nothing we know about brains that is conceivably relevant to marketing unless you regard marketing as pulling the wool over people's eyes using pseudoscience. But that hasn't stopped people trying to do studies that simulate science related to brands and advertising and consumers. If you were in charge of the marketing department of a large company and you could figure out how consumers behave and why they behave, why they make decisions in one way, and how to get them to prefer one brand over another, you'd be super rich. And it'd be an insult to all of neuroscience. I'll give you an example of a neuromarketing study. In this small study, whose source reference I've lost and I don't regret that, subjects were given a blind Coke-Pepsi test. So they sip one drink, and then they sip the other drink, and they say which they prefer. And if you do this blind and you don't tell people which drink is which, about 50% prefer Coke and about 50% prefer Pepsi. And you can document in the scanner, for example, you can compare the condition of drinking Coke with the condition of drinking Pepsi. Now, interpreting, making sense of that is another thing, but there will be some difference between the two conditions. There's more sugar in Pepsi, I think. So they're slightly different in constitution, so somewhere along the line there'll be some kind of a difference. This is, of course, nonsensically reported as reward centers lighting up. Poor old dopamine is brought to the table. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter to which it would be very foolish to assign a simple function. But that's the kind of story that journalists like. However, this is completely unsurprising. What they did then was they repeated the study, but this time they told them which brand was which. And now 75% preferred Coke. Would you believe it? Actually, if you tell people one of these is Coke, one of them is Pepsi, that's what happens. Coke has a stronger brand. Now, because you have a contrast, there will be minimal differences in blood flow between the two conditions. You may have to do very many scans to find it. There'll be something there because they're not identical conditions. So the report says a new area in prefrontal cortex, remember Phineas Gage? Lit up, nothing lights up. And this was then associated with brand awareness. I hope you have your tinfoil hat on when you're reading this, because this is such nonsense it beggars belief. Ask yourself what assumptions researchers are making about the brain, about people as a whole, and about brands, as if the brands occurred as a natural kind that could be studied in this manner. There's too much of this around. We don't have time and space to debunk all these abuses of neuroscience. I'll mention one more, which is of longer provenance, predating all these fancy imaging techniques, and that's neurolinguistic programming. Neurolinguistic programming is a genre of magic, which has no relation to neuroscience. no relation to the linguistic sciences, and has nothing to do with programming. So it couldn't be more inappropriately labeled, and you can think what you like of it as a form of entertainment, as a form of exerting influence over people. Knock yourself out. But the term neuro-linguistic programming is completely wrong. Now, there's so much of this around. There's also people like me who push back against it. There's some blogs there, Neurobolics and the Neuroskeptic, who provide some very insightful writing on this, and the required reading will have some stuff on neuromarketing. Just be careful when people use the word neuro. Check their credentials.